agenda in Britain and on South Asian politics. She's the founder member of the South Asia Solidarity Group and the Freedom Without Fear platform, and was a former board member of Imkaan, a Black, South Asian, and minority ethnic women's organization dedicated to combating the violence against women in Britain. She was a founder member of Awaz and an active member of OWAAD. She's the author, amongst other books, of Dreams, Questions, Struggles, South Asian Women in Britain, The Challenging Road, Women in Eritrean Revolution, and a number of others. Finding a Voice, first published in 1978 and winning the Martin Luther King Memorial Prize Award in that year, was established really a new discourse on South Asian women's lives and struggles in Britain. Through discussions and interviews and quite intimate one-to-one conversations with South Asian women in their own language, in Urdu, Hindi, Bengali, English, it explored family relationships, the violence of immigration policies, deeply colonial mental health services, the militancy at work, and also friendship and love. This was a time when, in the 1970s, when anti-racist and working class struggles were fairly iconic, and they were presented in that book from the point of view of women who actually participated and led these struggles. We were very pleased at Daraja Press to be able to publish a new edition of the preface, with a preface by Mina Kandasamwi, some historical photographs added, and a remarkable new chapter in Conversation with Finding a Voice, which is 40 years on, in which a new generation of South Asian women wrote about their own lives and struggles and weaving them around those portrayed in the book. So I'm really pleased to welcome Amrit, who is, I must declare, also an old friend, but even better to have you on the show. Welcome, Amrit.
Thank you, Feroz. It's so good to see you and to be here.
That's great. Amrit, gender and racism in the time of COVID. We read a lot about the extent to which this virus, this pandemic has hit the UK, and it seemingly bizarre and different changing policies by the government. Could you give us some sort of outline of what the situation in the UK is?
Well, the number of deaths is enormous. We've had 20,000 people dying. And that does not include people who have died in care homes. That's just hospital deaths. The lack of PPE, the lack of any kind of care for people who get ill, they're simply given a phone number to call, is deeply shocking. But what's more shocking, perhaps, is the kind of policies which lie behind this. And I think that's what it's only by understanding those that we can fully understand what this crisis means.
It seems to me that the policies seen from outside seem to be sort of Malthusian or really dismiss, wanting to just say we don't really care about the old, the sick, or the Black people, the minority ethnic communities. Is that a false impression?
No, that's absolutely right. They have this. They had for a long time this notion of herd immunity, and in some ways they are still acting as though that is their policy. So the very fact that deaths in care homes are not listed, nobody knows how many people have died, shows their attitude to the elderly. But it also shows their attitude to the workers in those care homes, so most of whom are, many of whom are migrant workers, many of whom are Black or minority ethnic Asian. So there's that. And then there's the attitude to the disabled. I mean, just a couple of days ago, we were told that in several parts of the country, the disabled will not be given any social care services from now on. And, then there is, of course, the people who have so-called underlying health problems, which is really the majority, very large proportion of people with high blood pressure, people with tendency to diabetes, a whole lot of other things like that. And then, of course, there's the homeless, so, it really is telling this vast category of people that you are worthless, your lives don't matter.
So effective. I mean, I have no idea whether it's intended or not, but it seems to be the effect is a eugenicist effect. It's about getting rid of or dismissing the importance of humans who this particular government doesn't have any time for. Is that
That's
what is happening?
absolutely right, but it is deliberate because it was, this was mentioned before that it doesn't really matter if pensioners die. It was actually said by Dominic Cummings, who was one of the extreme ultra-right advisors to Boris Johnson. So it was a definite thing. I mean, the other really shocking thing about what's been happening is the number of deaths of BAME people. That's Black, Asian, minority ethnic. That's the term which is used in Britain. Awkward though it is, and sometimes it's convenient to use it. So 68% of the NHS staff who've died, and more than 100 people, 100 workers, doctors, nurses, and so on have died. 68% of them are BAME. 38% of the people who've contracted COVID-19 are BAME. And that's at a time when we are 14% in this country. So you can imagine the scale of discrimination, the impact it's had on people, Black people, Asian people, people of from the global South, originating from the global South. And it's because it reveals a kind of very deep racism in the health service, and of course not just in the health service, but in the health service there's bullying, there's doctors of color, nurses of color who are pushed to work in COVID wards. They are not given PPE. Just today we heard of a hospital worker who was suspended for asking for PPE.
Yes.
PPE, of course, the personal protection equipment. And there has been a total lack of interest in ordering PPE for months and months, although they knew the pandemic was coming. They had been warned, they were fully aware of it. And they claim to be prepared for it. So it's a horrific situation. In fact, recently a junior doctor commented that Black and brown bodies are being seen as expendable. Right? And, of course, as you and I know, this has been the case. I mean, our deaths don't matter historically. You just have to look at the many wars launched in comparatively recent years by America and Britain. And I mean, we were the collateral damage. So, Black and brown bodies they are expendable. And it's interesting because, Boris Johnson is always comparing the situation to a war situation, which of course it's not. And NHS workers are actually saying that this is not a war. Don't send me on a suicide mission, one of them said. Another worker said, which it is really. I mean, and another worker was saying, calling us heroes because every Thursday we're supposed to clap for them. and calling us heroes makes our death somehow acceptable. So that's, in terms of racism, it's very starkly visible.
But is it because there is an intentional racist policy, or is this just, as some of the people I've interviewed on this show have said, that what COVID has done, what this virus has done, is to remove a veil from our eyes to be able to see the actual real nature of the British society? What would you say to that?
I think that's right. I think it certainly shows up what British society is like. But at the same time, I think there is an element of deliberate racism as well. I think it's two together because they must be aware that these things are happening. Now, even now, when people are asking for an inquiry into the deaths of BAME people in the health service, or even more broadly, the government is saying it's going to set up an inquiry and it's going to be headed by Trevor Phillips. Now, Trevor Phillips is a man who was suspended from the Labour Party for Islamophobia. So you can imagine, their attitude. It's very cynical and certainly not embarrassed at being racist at all. But I think I just wanted to say,
please go ahead.
The other aspect of this, which is extremely concerning, is the horrific rise in violence against women. What we must also realize, of course, is that a lot of the workers in the NHS are women, and a lot of the care home workers are women. But on a different level, that's in terms of domestic violence or violence within the home, as it were. That violence has increased vastly. The number of deaths has doubled, literally. And, women are locked down with perpetrators. They're pushed back into the family, which itself is a very regressive move. And they have no means of escape. Making phone calls is difficult. Calling for help in any way is extremely difficult. And the lockdown home is like a crucible, really, where male power and male control can thrive and grow to terrifying proportions.
So, how is this being interpreted? You and I might talk about this as a reflection of the racist nature of Britain, but I've read about various tropes like, black people are culturally not able to deal with this, that they have low plane thresholds or similar characterization. In other words, it's the fault of black people. When I say black, I'm using it in the way we used to use it in the 70s to talk about black and Asian and minority ethnic and migrant communities and so on. But yes, is this victim blaming or is there some validity to these kind of accusations?
That's a really interesting question because if you think about it, the whole culture has been used by the British state from way back when to justify racism, and also culture has also been like there's been an attempt to reshape it in a way, So you have the early days, say the 70s, and particularly when I wrote my book around the end of the 70s, you had the period of assimilation when the culture of black people in this country was seen as dangerous and bad and sometimes non-existent. And so they had then their presence had to be diluted. So kids were bussed out of their towns to schools far away, and so on and so on. So that was the attitude at that time. And this was followed by the multicultural phase when we were told that we had culture indeed. It was not that we didn't have a culture, but that our culture was the problem. That what was wrong with us, everything we're suffering, was really a result of our very problematic culture. And so we're seeing that again being raised in this context. I mean, back in the 70s, I remember looking at mental health issues and looking at the way in which women particularly were blamed constantly. Their culture was blamed for everything they went through. And at the same time, there were books written which claimed that Black people had very low pain thresholds and therefore they complained for no reason. And if you look at what's happening now, I mean, there was about a month back, a woman called Kayla Williams, who was struggling to breathe, was in acute pain, was dying really. And she was simply told that she was not a priority. So she wasn't taken to hospital. And she died. She was 37 years old and she had 3 children. So this is how the whole question of pain thresholds works in reality, and how the way in which culture is utilized to explain all this away. Now we're being told that we have big families and this is a big problem for us. Nobody thinks about issues like poverty, inequality, the stress of racism. We're told we've got underlying conditions of, of malnutrition, of high blood pressure, and what causes these things if one just stops and thinks. So that is really to say that that inequality, that racism is not relevant. What is relevant is that you are to blame for your own culture, for the things you do. So that's very much the whole question of the way in which culture is used.
Well, it seems we haven't moved that far further since Margaret Thatcher talked about Britain and being swamped by an alien culture. I mean, it does strike me that somebody quipped once that there are two types of people who are vulnerable to to COVID. One is those with underlying health problems, and the other is the people with underlying wealth problems. And
That's true. That's right. Absolutely. Yeah.
and given the sort of the structure of British society, I mean, it is the Black, Asian, ethnic minority, migrant communities who do the shit jobs, who get the lowest pay, and so on. But one of the things that you wrote about in your book, Finding a Voice, was that you highlighted the whole issue of immigration and immigration laws, which set the basis for the kind of racism that evolved. That migration and immigration was blamed for the racism of British people. And more recently, we've seen the sort of hostile environment created by successive Home Secretaries in the UK. And you wrote about virginity tests and so on. What other things are going on? Have virginity tests come back? What is happening in Britain in relation to immigration and its relationship to not just racism, but the impact on women and the COVID pandemic?
Well, I think, around the end of the 70s was a very interesting period because it saw the beginnings of the authoritarian state as we know it now. Now, of course, it's grown into a huge monster. And also we saw the first Immigration Act, which allowed immigration officers to operate within the country, not just at the ports of entry or the borders. And we, of course, we saw the setting up of the first detention centers, which I wrote about at that time. And in a way, and that's where the virginity tests were also being carried out at that time. These were tests which were supposed to show whether a woman was a virgin. And if she was, then she couldn't be a wife coming to join her husband. If she was not a virgin, then she couldn't be a fiancée. Such was the extreme patriarchal attitude of the British state. So what we have now is that immigration officers, I mean, 71, 78, they were allowed to operate within the country. But now, everyone is an immigration officer. If you're a landlord, you have a right to check, so you're an immigration officer if your tenant is legally there. If you're an employer, it's the same. Universities do this. So, and it encourages a culture of snitching on people. So you can imagine the effect that this has, not only on migrants, not only on people with insecure immigration status, which is terrifying, but also on the Black population in general. And I'm using Black as we did in the old days to mean all of us. Sorry, that was a bit of a noise, I think, anyway. Is it okay?
Sorry. That's okay. Yeah, continue.
So now, we see the hostile environment, which really is, as I was telling you, allows this kind of spying on people and encourages racism. But the hostile environment is not simply a vague term. It was actually introduced as a policy by Theresa May in 2012 and has gone viral since then. So it's something which has heightened racism to unforeseeable, unprecedented levels. And this is, this is really what rules the lives of Black people in this country, really. You talk about racism, and perhaps the most important aspect of that is the hostile environment. It also has an effect on students, for example, international students, international academics. They are also unable to, live freely. So that is like basically the immigration laws. And with that, the nature of the workforce has also changed. While in the 70s and 80s, we had people who came from the colonies and ex-colonies to work in Britain. They were mainly, in the earlier phase, they were mainly from South Asia and from the Caribbean, and some from Africa. But then now what's happened is, as a result of imperialism's new colonial wars, we see workers who are migrants, economic migrants, as well as asylum seekers, from all the places where these wars have taken place, from the Middle East, from Africa, from South America, and so on. And the jobs they go to are these largely extremely low paid, and they're very often in the gig economy, which means that, there's a kind of feminization of labor. Many of the workers are women anyway. They work as maybe cleaners, care home workers, delivery workers, and so on. The attitude of the trade unions also, the established trade unions also, has been to completely neglect them, because racism runs very deep in this country. But what is very encouraging is that many of them have organized. Many workers have been involved in truly inspiring struggles and have won some victories. They have got their own unions, like, the United Voices of the World, and the IWGB. These are, two of the main unions which are involved, and they are run by, they are devoted to working for workers in this situation. But what this means also is that the situation of women, the violence which women face, is also violence at work. I mean, this is something we have to understand very clearly, that working in a care home, not being given PPE, having insecure status, what it does to a human being. And really, at the worst end of the scale, there are the domestic workers who are here they come from the Philippines largely, or many from Africa, some from India, and they are tied to their particular employer on 6-month visas. And under this in the COVID crisis, they're having to work incredibly hard because the number of people in the house has increased, and they are constantly watched and bullied and forced to do huge amounts of work. And when they're COVID patients, they're the ones who do that caring without any question of any PPE. So these are the kind of different situations of violence faced by women in the new Britain, as it were.
But it seems to me that this imperial state, its social mechanism, its social service mechanism is almost entirely held up by both women and by people, or black people, but black people to include, like Cedric Robinson points out, that term was used for Irish people back in the day, and we have people from Europe who are also treated in that kind of way. But I'd like you to help us understand more. Is this combination of patriarchy and racism, which are sisters and brothers? They're twins, in a sense, almost inseparable. And so, how does that itself work out in terms of organizing in times of COVID? I remember in your writing in Finding a Voice that the ability of women to go out and engage in those struggles was in some cases opposed by the men, and so does this still continue? So what is the implications of dealing with both patriarchy and racism for organizing in the time of COVID?
I think, this is a very interesting question. The fact is that, as you know, of course, that issues of race are always gendered. And similarly, issues of gender are always racialized. I mean, there is no escape. And what we have in Britain is the British state highlighting a kind of the evil of South Asian patriarchy, right? Hyper patriarchy, as it were, and apparently trying to confront it. But rather than confront it, in most cases, they actually support it and intensify it. And just to give a couple of examples, there's the whole question of immigration, where when particularly now, when women come, if their marriages break up, then they are likely to be slapped with the no recourse to public funds situation. So they are therefore not able to access almost any kind of social care, let alone going out or finding refuges or, getting any support. So you can see how immigration and patriarchal control go hand in hand. There's also obviously like the whole question of the way in which a husband would behave. He could take away the passport of the woman. He could say he's going to send her home and he won't bring her back. These are very, very common. So, particularly as far as South Asian patriarchy is concerned, this is completely tied up to the immigration laws. And, in that context, in the context of, to go back to the question of virginity tests, something which is worth mentioning is that now detention centers, of course, have become much more widespread. And there's specific women's detention centers. There's one in Yarlswood, a very notorious one, where recently there was a COVID case. Now, in Yarlswood, women have been known to be raped, to be sexually abused by the guards who are corporate firms run these detention centers now. So, what can you say on the scale of violence against women? It's directly state violence, which locks into other aspects of violence. So, this is one aspect in which immigration laws tie into patriarchy. But then there are other policies which we see where the state has deliberately attempted to erase the struggles of Black feminists, particularly in the context of fighting violence against women.
In the 1970s, one of those interesting things was how women organized to set up refuges for women. That those who faced domestic violence were able to find some solace and support in these refugees. They got refuge from that violence. But in this neoliberal period with cuts to social expenditure, how many of those refugees have actually survived?
Well, Feroz, it wasn't really the 70s so much. It was really the late 70s when I wrote Finding a Voice in 78. We were just working on trying to establish the first South Asian women's refuge in London, right? But in the 80s, they certainly thrived, and there was, despite huge problems of funding and so on, there has been a network. There was a network set up of Black and South Asian women's refuges across the country, and these were doing fantastic work. They were run by Black feminists for women of color. They were aware of the particular kinds of patriarchy faced by women in that situation. And they also did a lot of outreach work and mental health support work, which are very important. I mean, something we must understand is that a woman who faces violence, domestic violence, often suffers from PTSD. So, this is obviously a very, very serious a very, very serious blow to a woman, in terms of her life, and she does need a lot of support. Now, what's happened from 2004 onwards, and has now come to fruition, as it were, is that those specialist refuges which have been set up and which had really quite a magnificent network across the country, and was set up with so much love and care and hard work, those have now been a very large proportion of them have been closed down. And they are being replaced by large generic refuges, which still don't cater for everybody anyway. And the work that they do is obviously not, it's not what women need very often. And so we find that, that whole work of which was done has been more or less erased. And not only that, what we find now is a complete change in policy towards violence against women. So whereas we were working for prevention, we were working to strengthen women, we were working to try and tip the balance of power within the house, within the residence. What we find now is punitive action against the perpetrators. So it's not, so really it's sort of, essentially the domestic violence laws are very much sort of linked or very similar to the laws, the anti-terrorism legislations. And in the last, this period of lockdown, we've seen a huge number of arrests of men. That's about 100 per day, I was told, which is, pretty massive. And at the same time, of course, the number of deaths of women has increased. It's double now what it used to be before the lockdown. And, the new, under this new, very neoliberal approach, we find that women are merely pawns in the hands of the state. Their cases are dealt with by a whole plethora of state employees who come together to examine so-called high-risk cases and decide what will happen. And what is really deeply shocking and really shows what this is like is that women are not consulted when these conferences take place. So they're not consulted about their own future. And recent in the 2018 law on domestic violence, on domestic abuse, which came in, there's women who withdraw cases could very well also face prison. So it's really about punishment. It has it obliterates women's agency, and at the same time there is no acknowledgement that male violence is about control and power. There's no acknowledgement of the toxic masculinity of neoliberalism, which is so apparent. I was just looking at a news item about pornography. Now, this is in India, but I'm sure the same thing happens in Britain, that, the child pornography with violence has escalated vastly in this period of lockdown. And that's because men have more time. I mean, that's what masculinity has become. It's a very frightening scenario, which is not being acknowledged at all,
I mean, that's a interesting point you make. I just read a piece by somebody called Brian Murphy, which I posted on Facebook, pointing out that one of the problems is that men don't talk about violence against women. They don't talk about that their own men being violent, and that is that happening in Britain at all? Are men speaking out against patriarchy?
Well, I mean, you've had the occasional case where, sons have supported their mothers. I mean, there have been cases like that, which have been fantastic. But in general, this is a very tricky subject because a lot of men's groups are essentially extremely sexist and unpleasant, So, I don't know what men speaking out would really do. I think it needs a far deeper sort of, a lot more thought. It has to go into how you counter this, And it has not even been acknowledged, let alone be countered. I mean, really, when you look at all these policies made in countries like Britain, America, where is the acknowledgement that there is this crisis of toxic masculinity and that needs to be dealt with? I don't see any acknowledgement from any of the state powers Because, of course, look at the leaders themselves. And also look at the way in which neoliberalism is shading into fascism. So all of these things come together. That kind of masculinity is very much part of that politics.
There's a comment here from Camille Starling. Well said, Amrit. Men speaking out is not a solution, especially if those men who do speak are often found to be perpetrators themselves.
Absolutely.
Enough said.
Well, we all know about this exists on a whole different level, on a lot of different levels. We all know about the new man, the man who knows everything, the man who knows everything. And yet, that same man could be very violent. If you look at my second book about South Asian women, which is called Dreams, Questions, Struggles, there's case after case where the man is extremely kind, he's a community worker, he helps people at home. What does he do to the women and the children in his family? It's unspeakable.
So let's turn back to this issue of organizing in the time of COVID. What is it actually? What is happening? What are the constraints in organizing, and what are the possibilities for organizing, or are we just locked down as victims?
I think at this point, people are not finding that easy to organize. What is possible, or what is being done, what is ongoing, is the work to help domestic violence survivors. But I think what people are doing is planning for what will happen after the lockdown, because on the one hand we can see the kind of extreme repression and extreme right politics, which they're going to try and hit us with. But at the same time, people are angry. Women are planning to organize, to get rid of these ridiculous structures on violence against women, and to have something which actually helps women. At the same time, people of color are also looking for change. And I think we need to tell the state and make it absolutely clear that this is not the domestic violence services we want. We want something entirely different. And that, we will not accept this level of racism. And I think that may well happen.
One of the things I've quoted quite often has been an essay by Arundhati Roy, in which she talks about a portal. And describes that historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different, she says. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. Well, it seems I always get worried when I hear the word afterwards. Well, after what? Do we wait until they've established their hegemony on what the new world will look like after, or can we afford to leave it till then? What can we do today to be organizing, even given the constraints that there are, to create the possibilities of a new world, to imagine that new world and to give it some existence today rather than wait for after?
I think, every step in this pandemic in Britain, at every step, is the people's demands which have pushed the government to do anything at all. Even now, they're saying that they will provide PPE. That's as a result of pressure from doctors. Even now, they're saying that they will, help people in a variety of ways. That's also pressure from the public. So I think, at every stage, a struggle is going on. Personally, I like you, don't like to think of afterwards. But also, I don't like to see it as a portal exactly, because I prefer to see it as an ongoing struggle, which will surely have to bring change. I mean, you can see that in parts of Europe, the public service are being extended. Even in Britain, one can hope that private hospitals would eventually be taken over. They have to realize that things simply they're not fit for purpose in the current, neoliberal privatized form that we see. And that has to change. So, it is really an ongoing struggle. It doesn't begin and end. But I think in terms of more vigorous activity outside, because how many people have access to internet? It's a luxury for many people. So it will be far easier to organize once the lockdown ends, at least. Of course, that won't be necessarily when COVID-19 is beaten.
So, I mean, you've raised so many interesting issues here. I'd love to spend the rest of the afternoon talking through some of those with you. But I think we coming towards the end of our talk. I just wondered whether there are any particular messages you'd like to give as a sort of as your final point here.
I think one of the messages which is very important is that what's happening to Black, minority, ethnic, Asian people in this country um, is um, is very much like it's very, very important for people outside the country to look at and be aware of, because this is the heart of the struggle. This is what will make the future. The future really is in the hands of people in this category who are hardest hit and who are most eager to and have a history of resistance. And I think that in that sense, there should be links of solidarity between all of us. Whether it's people in India, I mean, I certainly work very closely with solidarity initiatives through South Asia Solidarity Group in India, or Black people in America, or people in other countries, people in the countries of Africa or across Europe, for migrants. And I think those links are very important because this pandemic is global and it reflects global capital. So our struggle also must have those links of solidarity.
I think that's a really important point, Amrit. I'm not sure if you're aware that in the USA on Friday, May Day, 1st of May, a 24-hour event is being organized online to connect up struggles across the different parts of the US where people are organizing and giving voice to their demands. But they are very keen also to have international speakers online. I will be hosting a couple of sessions on Friday, and I wonder whether you might put me in touch with others from the South Asia Solidarity Movement and those from India who might express some words of both analysis and of solidarity in that thing. Because I think you're right. We are facing an international issue, and it is that unity that we can help create that is going to be the important thing to move things along. It's not to downplay the domestic struggles, but that's international solidarity, I think, is an important dimension. And maybe this might lead to similar initiatives in the UK, a general strike, or at least a debate about the possibilities of a strike in support of the health workers, the migrant workers, the underpaid, the domestic workers, and so on and so forth, which opens up that debate in a more public domain.
I think
So
that's very exciting. In fact, the gender strike is being talked about. So
great, great. Well, I look forward to hearing more about that. And like to thank you, Amrit, for joining us on this show. I know there's going to be a huge amount of interest already expressed, but also online once this is recorded. And so really pleased. Thank you for
thank you for
joining
inviting
us.
Thank you.
Yeah, so all the very best, and I look forward to, I hope, visiting you sometime soon once the lockdown is over.
That
But in the meantime, you take care and keep the struggle going.
you take care, Rose. Great to be here.
Okay.
Bye.
That was Amrit Wilson speaking to me about gender and racism in the UK. Uh, uh, Amrit is the author of Finding a Voice, the second edition of which we published last year, and you can find it online at this URL at darajapress.com. If you just go there, you'll find the picture of Finding a Voice there, and feel free to order copies or download the PDF and EPUB for free or for a little donation. So thank you for being with us on this show. It's been a really interesting discussion with Amrit. Late tonight, but for Indonesia early morning, I will be speaking to somebody about organizing for farmers organizing in Indonesia, but in particular about the origins of the coronavirus in industrial agriculture. So join us later tonight, and thank you for being with us. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press saying thank you and goodbye.